Hey Priyanka.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. How are you today?
Good.
All right. Can you introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Priyanka. I'm 27 years old now. Gonna be 28 in a month.
No.
I grew up in America, but come from an Indian family. And I moved to Tanzania about 4 years ago, so I've been living in Tanzania for the past 4 years.
Okay.
I think oftentimes when I talk about sex, it's usually the physical act of having sex. I think there's a lot that goes around it, like intimacy, desire, want. But I don't think I always like loop in that into like when I'm saying sex. It's like a very literal term to me. And then when I'm talking about it, oftentimes like all of the other stuff matter, but I speak about it separately and not necessarily as like a combined experience, which is interesting to think about.
So what kind of, if I understood you correctly, you're saying there's some acts that you count as sex. What would be other acts that you don't really consider as sex, but is actually sex to you, if that makes any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's like a lot from the beginning, right? Like initial attraction, like the foreplay or the touching of sex, or even like the cuddling and the intimacy after, that I sometimes speak about separately. And like oftentimes, like when I'm talking about sex, it's like that one main act, but there's like so much around it that's involved in the full process.
Okay.
The first time I like learned about sex or even thought about sex, I had a wet dream when I was really young.
Okay.
It was even before I like knew what sex was or had seen any sexual contact. It just kind of came to me. I was trying to think about the age, and it was like younger than I remembered. I remember both being scandalized but super intrigued by this dream that I had. And I also remember thinking it was like revolutionary, right? I was like, oh, like two people, like bodies like this sitting together and having sex. And I didn't even know the term at the time. And I remember for like a week I would have this recurring dream. And I thought I had just learned something new from my subconscious, which I thought was interesting. But that was like the first time that I'd thought about it, and I didn't even know that that's what it was called really until much later.
That is so interesting. So this was just visuals that your brain put together.
Actually,
that is very
seen
interesting.
Any sex or porn or anything. It was like I think when I was 9, like young.
So when did you come to realize that that's actually sex that I was envisioning in my head?
I think probably like 13ish, like a bit later, because I think it became like much more of a hot topic in school. People were talking about it, and then I was like, oh, like that's what that is. Like put words to like what I was seeing in my head.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, right now it's not very active, unfortunately. I think right now it's more of like, I'm trying to think, like things that come up when you want something, but it just like isn't like a physical manifestation in my life right now. I think in previous times it's, I don't know, both been positive and negative in many different ways. Like it's trying to think. Like when I was younger, I think it was a very different experience that I had with it, and I think I've grown to enjoy it and like it more now. And I feel a bit more in control of it now. And so my evolution with kind of how I've experienced it has changed. And usually it can be very positive. I think going back to my first answer on all the stuff around it, I think what I struggle with is like the relationships that come out of it sometimes. And so like, you know, like the texting after the event, or like, you know, setting expectations of what that could be is usually the harder part of the whole process. To me, it's like the human elements of it that can be the challenge. Yes, I think we often underestimate how much communication is a part of it, around it and kind of in it. I think there's also verbal and nonverbal communication, and so like it doesn't all have to be exactly told. I think there's beauty in sex that's like a lot unsaid, but it's got to be like reciprocal in a lot of ways and understood. So yeah, I would say communication is really important.
Okay. This is not part of the questions. I'm just curious. Do you have, if you're willing to share a scenario of where you had a good communication of, you had, what am I trying to say? Do you have an example of a sexual encounter where, or relationship where you had good sexual communication, if that makes any sense?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I think I've had a few probably, and I've had a few that probably aren't good communication too. And it's hard to like pinpoint the difference in terms of the actual like verbal or nonverbal cues. But I think sometimes it was just like how I felt based on the communication that was happening or the outcomes of the communication. And one example I think after having sex with someone, I like had a really long conversation with them after, and it made me feel kind of better. And we didn't even talk about the sex, but it made me feel better about the experience in general. And I think it helped in terms of like what they like, don't like, and it felt a lot more kind of comfortable rather than like encounters where I feel more stressed about it after. Like, do they have a good time? Do they not have a good time? And so that's probably one. I think it's always like the first couple of times. I think new sexual encounters are always anxiety inducing because you just don't know the other person. You don't know what they like. You don't know how you perform in that situation. I think those are always kind of anxiety inducing. And I think sometimes there is a level of performance anxiety, especially in the beginning. Because I think there's a lot of buildup usually towards it. Like you're attracted to this person, you know, like all of this has happened, and then this is supposed to be this like big event. Maybe not even that big, but like
there's a significant event.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a step in a different direction. And so like all of the first things could be great, but you're like, will this be good? Will I be good in this? And so that's kind of always been kind of anxiety inducing for me.
I don't think it's just you. I think I when you say the beginning of all relationships, like even I feel that as well. Like, because as you said, you don't know the other person. You're still trying to figure each other out. So it takes a few tries to finally get to a place where you're like, okay, we're now comfortable with each other. Yeah.
I think there is something nice in it too, and going back to communication, that sometimes it's like easier with the person based on the person. And because it's also new, you know, new things can be fun too. And sometimes I'm closer to that. I don't think I'm fully at that yet, but I think it could be a really kind of fun experience to like experiment with someone new too. But yeah, that's always been an issue.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there is overlap, but I think they do kind of sometimes exist separately. I think people can have sex and not be intimate. I think there is just like the physical act of having sex, and then intimacy is kind of like I was saying, like all of the stuff around it that builds the full experience. Me personally, I think I like enjoy the intimacy part, potentially sometimes more than the sex, and so both of them together is like essential part of the experience. And I just know others like can do just the sex and like enjoy it and fully feel pleasure from it, but I think I'm unable to kind of separate the two as much. I think it can be, but I think there's always this like sense of this person has seen you in a different light than anyone else, and so while it's still casual, there's still a different place than just being a friend, right? And so we want to say that everything is like can be purely casual, but I think that even in the most casual of situations or relationships, there's that person does play a different role in your life than kind of the normal person. And there's some like elevated state of not power or like a different dynamic that exists that kind of hinders it from being like purely casual. I struggle with casual relationships. I think, like I was saying, like I enjoy the intimacy part of it, so I always feel myself somewhat connected to someone, even if I know I'm not in like a full relationship or not even looking for a relationship. They do play like a different role in my life than just a friend. So
Um, what is casual sex to you?
I think it's probably like hooking up without the expectations of like any kind of other relationship or reliability from the person. To that.
Mm. Okay.
Consent, I think, is very important. I think it can be challenging because there's a lot of sex that, like I was saying, is like verbal and non-verbal, and things change throughout the experience or throughout time. And sometimes I think we also don't fully know how we feel until after we feel it, and so we're not always the best communicators either. But I do think it's really important to be fully consensual in a situation, to like really ensure that the other person and yourself are doing what you want to do. And I will say, like, I think sometimes I've felt that in the moment, and then after have been like, did I really feel that way? Which can be kind of tricky and challenging. And I think sometimes we want to think consent is just very black and white, and there are areas that it is black and white. There's obvious no's, but there's also kind of gray ground in between that I don't think we talk about all the time, because our kind of language around sex is so not bland, but like baseline, that we don't even talk about times when like things shift from consensual to non-consensual, or like I was saying, after the fact, if you feel differently than you did in the moment, and like how we have communicated and not communicated those things. But I think we're getting better at it. I think when I was younger, it was a very different conversation than what people are having today.
Absolutely.
I think I'm not that comfortable with it. I think it's definitely something that I've thought about and I'm bad at doing. I think I'm bad at doing it in the moment. Depending on the partner, I think after is usually always easier. I think sometimes I'm like, oh, I'm just gonna let it happen and then we'll figure it out later. It's funny because I think I'm a very like straightforward person in all aspects of my life, and I'm like, like successful, have like a bunch of direct reports. Like who I am like at work is so different than who I think I sometimes am like in these situations, where I feel a lot more timid than I usually am kind of outside of it, and so I don't think I am very good at kind of expressing desire and displeasure, especially in the moment.
I can relate to that because I literally feel the exact same way. Like I could talk about it after the fact, but like in that moment, I'm sort of like, let's just get on with it, and we'll figure it out later.
Exactly.
Like I'm not dying. It's not that bad. But I don't think it should be that way.
I know. I think I sometimes am overly cautious of the other person's experience, and maybe I've also been trained to do that. That I am the secondary person in the experience, and so oftentimes I think it comes from a root of like, I am second to like making this experience good for this person, rather than making this experience good for myself. And I think, like you're saying, like I can do it after the fact, but then it's like a longer term goal than it is like in that situation. I think so. Like, I think, having a good time, for myself is a good part of it. Kind of pleasuring the other person is a part of it. An overall good experience. I think it looks so different for me from time to time, depending on the mental state that I'm in, or like who it is, where I am. And so I think there's no one perfect formula for me, and I think it's just so different time to time. And so figuring that out, I think, is important. Like if I'm in a really good place in my head or in kind of life at the time, like what I'm looking for looks very different than I think when I'm like down. And so it really does evolve with time.
When that happened to you?
Yeah, especially in the beginning, I think I have a decent amount of performance anxiety. I don't think I've necessarily dealt with it outside of just like continuing to do it. I also think once it's been a long time, sometimes there's even more performance anxiety, and depending on the person and how much I actually like them or don't like them, there's a lot of performance anxiety. I don't think I've come to like a formula on how to resolve that necessarily at all. I think right now I don't fully worry about how I look naked. I think there was different points in my life that I was more insecure when I was younger, probably. But I do like appreciate my naked body. Like I think it's like we're lucky to have the bodies that we live in. It's interesting I say that, and I think my biggest insecurity is the size of my butt, just like in general life, but not necessarily like
As in
naked.
it's too big or too small?
Yeah, too big sometimes.
Oh, okay.
Well, like I think I grew up around a culture that like prioritized very lean women, and I never had that. I was always like skinny, but I was never like too small, and so that's like a life insecurity of mine. But interestingly, I don't think it translates to the bedroom or myself naked. It's more like walking, just like a general walking around life insecurity. But yeah, I think I'm relatively comfortable with my naked body. I think it's taken time to get there for sure. And then kind of like, yeah, other sexual insecurities. I think not being good in bed is the sexual insecurity of everyone. And interesting, I was having a conversation yesterday with a lot of different women, and I've never had this, but and I also never realized this, that people are insecure about their vagina sizes.
Oh yes, that is a thing. Yes.
It you know, like I've actually never thought about it, but I realize other people's shapes and vaginas are like a big insecurity, which, you know, I think I'm lucky that I've just never thought about it, or it's never come up in conversation, or I've just never, you know, thought about it at all. But I mean, I think in the culture that I grew up in too, virginity is seen that way. I don't think it's as like pent up to be what it is, you know? It's just one of those things. I think people should make the choice on whether they want to wait till they're married or not. I know a lot of people make that choice. I think it's harder in our society these days to make that choice, especially because of the way the relationships evolve. I do think sometimes people probably have sex too young in our culture too, because there's also a lot of pressure on doing it on both ends. And I think at a certain age you're probably not fully ready to do it, which isn't a conversation that's talked about all the time. And I don't think it's an either or, right? It's like choosing, having the empowerment and the autonomy to choose when you decide to have sex and what is right for you, is I think what's best for most people. Me personally, I don't think being a virgin before marriage is that important, but I know that for other people it is. So, and I think people are allowed to believe that. There were no conversations on this topic at all. I think sex was very taboo. I even remember as a kid, like when people would be kissing in movies, my parents would close my eyes as if like that's not something that we could even see. And it's funny, I think they've evolved a lot too since then. And I have to remind myself, you know, they grew up in a bit more of a conservative time in India. Their like experiences with all of this is so different than my own experience with a lot of this in the modern day. But yeah, not at all discussed. Still to this day, rarely discussed. And it was just not a topic to discuss.
Do you wish that you'd had these kinds of conversations in the home? Is there a part of you that feels like you wish you had these conversations? Or are you okay with having stumbled and figured your own way through this?
I have a younger sister who's like 10 years younger than me, and I think I sometimes put myself in that, like, what would younger me have wished? And I wish I was able to have some of these conversations kind of with my parents. I think that there's some families that talk about it in depth, and I don't need necessarily that, but like a safe space to talk about issues I think is healthy. And I think about, you know, in the future, if I have my own kids, I do think these are conversations to have. And even like I was talking to a friend who has a kid in Kenya, and he was like, we're going to start talking about sex to our daughter. And she was 8, and in my head that felt too young. And he was like, no, it's also in the sense of like, you know, a lot of abuse happens in different cultures, and so alerting your children to like what is and isn't right. And you know, like if someone touches you like this, please let us know. I think those are healthy conversations to have, and then evolving that at older ages to like, what is a healthy relationship? What is communication? What should you expect and not expect? I think are all healthy conversations to be having with kids.
Yeah. It's interesting that you thought 8 was too early,
I know.
because my sister has a son, and this year he's 3 this year, and they started having like conversations with him about like his private parts and how no one can touch them, they belong to him, and that kind of stuff. And he's really taken the lesson, because he won't even let me take him to pee anymore. He's like, you can't see my private parts, they're for me only, which I found to be quite interesting. I have a question for you. With regards to your sister, right? You mentioned that you've thought about whether if she's having those conversations. Are you having those conversations with her? Because I'm assuming your parents are not having those conversations with her.
Yeah, I think I've opened the stage to that if she ever wants to have those conversations, she can come to me and I won't judge her. We haven't had kind of in-depth conversations about it. I do know where she stands on a lot of stuff and where her friends are kind of socially. I don't think it's an uncomfortable conversation, but I think where I'm at, it's kind of like, and she's old enough now that if she wants to come to me about something, she knows that she can. And so there isn't like tension around those conversations between us.
Okay.
I think so. I think, you know, Indian culture can be very repressive towards sex, and so even like clothing that you wear is quite policed. The way that women behave or should not behave is quite policed. And so while I think I'm contrary to a lot of those, I do still think a lot of those things are in my head sometimes. And so they do influence kind of how I view myself or how I view kind of even conversations around sex. And I don't think these would be conversations that I still would have with a lot of people in my community. They're conversations that I have with friends. And I think that only started much later though, and didn't kind of happen when we were younger. Because I think all of us felt a little bit of shame around it. And so I think there was more shame younger, and then you kind of like grow to like have your own opinions, and so less so now. But I do think in the evolution of it, the cultural repression of sex did play kind of a big part in kind of my own experience with it early on. Yeah, it is interesting. Like when I first moved, and like I think African culture expressively is so different from Indian culture expressively in terms of, you know, the eroticism around dance and things like that. But at the same time, they're so similar in like the family structure and conversation around sex, and the conservatism around like, you know, if women get pregnant, they should go get married. You know, there's a lot of things around that I think there are similarities. And I think that dichotomy doesn't always make sense to me when I experience kind of African culture. I think the church probably plays a part in it. I think, you know, different people's experiences play a part in it, but I don't fully know the answer to that. But it is interesting to me that in my own culture, I think it makes sense we're repressed and then we don't talk about it. Versus it feels like here, in certain ways, people aren't as repressed, but in other ways, like the outcome of the expression is still not kind of a positive answer. And I also think kind of the sexual expectations on women are probably higher here than in other places. When I was younger, I actually like lived in Brazil for 2 months and then lived in Istanbul after, which were similar contrasts of cultures, where like in Brazil, I think, you know, women were very kind of expressive, sex was fine, and like, but then it felt like so much pressure to play that part, that I didn't fully feel like women were free there either. And then kind of vice versa in Istanbul, a much more conservative culture, and in neither one was the solution really, because we never got to the base root of like what is empowerment of your ability to talk about and kind of own sex. I I think it's changing, but I think it's changing slowly. Like, I think we have more changes, kind of, women in business, women in all of these other aspects, and women at the home, I actually think is like the slowest rate of change. I've read articles that's like the minute that people have children, kind of inequality in the household increases dramatically. I think there are still a lot of traditional home-based roles that women play, including in sex, that I haven't seen, and maybe I'm, an older generation now, really change that much. And I think there's conversations around it, but we're just only kind of at the, tipping iceberg of like what like a good society looks like in terms of giving women empowerment in the bedroom and in families. And I think it's hard. I think it's like, I don't know, like I think talking about it is one thing and like the actions are a different thing. And like you're saying, like starting kids very young in conversations takes a long time, right? And I think sometimes that even people that I interact with at my age, like are various different levels of like their own experiences with sex and women in sex. And so that can be a hard conversation, like me day to day. It's like, here's where I stand, here's where you stand, or you stand. But I think it'll get there. I think it is much slower than other aspects of women empowerment and things like that. I think a lot of it's because it is a tough topic to talk about, and because we don't have all the right answers, right? Like we were saying on consent, we're only starting to talk about consent, and even that in like a very black and white way. And so how do those conversations get deeper? And I also think it's hard for people who like haven't thought about things in a certain way and have been experiencing it to like now translate to like, what are the words I actually feel? I haven't been allowed to feel this way before. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
It definitely does. It definitely does. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's a lot I wish I had been taught. I wish it was just much more of like an open conversation on things like we're talking about pleasure for yourself, expectations of like other people in those situations. I think oftentimes people have sex for the first couple of times without really even like thinking about it, or just like because there's pressure enough to do it. And so having kind of conversations around that and just hearing other people's experiences with it. I think the older I get, the more that my friends are open to talking about it, and that's been like extremely like helpful. And like while I don't agree with everything, or it helps you kind of form your own opinions on what you should expect. And I think in the beginning we don't talk about it enough. And some things are like learning as you grow, and that will never change, but I think we can kind of do better in the beginning. No. The sex education curriculum when I grew up was about abstinence.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, like we learned about not having sex, which kind of adds to the issue, I think, in a lot of ways. Yeah, like we learned about the body parts in terms of science. We didn't learn about kind of any of the emotions or the other stuff that come with it. And we definitely didn't learn about how to have conversations with your partner about sex. We didn't learn about like, your own pleasure in the moment, which I think are all topics that people should be talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think porn plays a really big role in influencing culture, especially like, again, back to like when people first start having sex. I think you set your expectations based off of what you know, right? And because we're not having these conversations and it's taboo, like I think a lot of people learn from porn, which isn't always the best. And there's a wide range of it. I'm starting to see, like there's more stuff for women these days and stuff like that. But I also think that there's like a lot of negative stuff, which causes a lot of negative outcomes in society, or negative expectations of what sex should look like. And I think they can continue to do better on that. I don't think I have a clear answer on overall whether it's good or bad. I think it kind of depends. And different people, use it and look at it for different ways, right? So yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Priyanka. We've reached the end.
Thank you.